May 28, 1940. Berlin. Hermann Göring put down a report and laughed. Roosevelt just asked Congress for something impossible: 50,000 planes a year. The Americans were desperate. They didn't know anything about building warplanes. "Let them try," he told his staff. "They'll learn real quick that making bombers isn't like making cars." Here's the thing. Göring had every reason to feel confident. America had built just 3,611 military aircraft the year before. The Army Air Corps had 1,700 combat planes, most of them outdated. And now Roosevelt wanted to increase that by 14 times. It sounded absolutely wild. But in Detroit, something was already happening. A Danish immigrant named William Knudsen was about to prove that sometimes the craziest ideas aren't crazy at all. What happened next wasn't just a production increase. It was the biggest industrial miscalculation in human history. And Göring's laughter? That's going to echo through time as the sound of someone who got it catastrophically wrong. Before we get into how badly this went for him, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. What you're about to hear involves numbers that sound made up, one factory that shouldn't have been possible, and a miscalculation so massive it changed history. Drop a like and let's dive in. So let's set the scene. It's May 16th, 1940. German tanks are rolling through France like it's nothing. The whole world's watching Europe collapse in real time, and Roosevelt stands up in front of Congress and drops this absolute bomb. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." Get this, people thought he'd gone completely off the rails, and honestly, you can't blame them. The reaction wasn't just skepticism from Congress. Even America's allies were like, "Yeah, sure, buddy. Good luck with that." Because here's the reality they were all looking at. In 1939, America had cranked out exactly 3,611 military aircraft. Total. The Army Air Corps was sitting on 1,700 combat planes, and most of those were already outdated pieces of junk that wouldn't last 5 minutes in real combat. Roosevelt's asking for a 14-fold increase. That's not ambitious, that's borderline ridiculous. Nobody had ever scaled up manufacturing that fast for anything, let alone something as complex as military aircraft. But here's where it gets interesting. When they asked who could possibly pull this off, presidential advisor Bernard Baruch didn't even think about it. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. The guy literally said the same name 3 times. That's how confident he was that there was only one person for the job. Now, William Knudsen wasn't some government bureaucrat who'd spent his whole life pushing papers. This guy was the former president of General Motors. He'd been making $300,000 a year. And we're talking 1940s money here, so that's absolutely massive wealth. He walked away from all of it to work for Roosevelt at $1 per year. Yeah, you heard that right. $1 annually. Why would anyone do that? Because Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who loved his adopted country, and he genuinely believed in what Roosevelt was trying to accomplish. But more importantly, he brought something nobody else in government had. He actually knew how to make mass production work on a scale that seemed impossible. Knudsen had spent years at GM perfecting the assembly line process for automobiles. He understood how to break down complex manufacturing into repeatable steps, how to coordinate thousands of workers, how to manage supply chains across multiple facilities, and now he was going to take those same automotive principles and apply them to building bombers and fighters. It had never been done before, but if anyone could figure it out, it was him. Listen, the transformation didn't happen overnight, but it started way faster than anyone expected. Knudsen got to work immediately. He started pulling in automotive executives, engineers who understood high-volume manufacturing, people who knew how to scale things up quick. He wasn't interested in the old way of doing things, the slow, careful, craftsman-style aircraft building that had been standard forever. He wanted speed, volume, efficiency, and it worked. By December 1941, just 18 months after Roosevelt's announcement, American factories were pumping out 2,000 military aircraft every single month. Let that sink in for a second. That's a 20-fold increase from where they'd been just 2 years earlier. 2 years. That's how fast things were moving. Ford Motor Company announced they're building this absolutely massive bomber plant at Willow Run in Michigan. Boeing's expanding their facilities in Seattle. Douglas Aircraft is hiring workers by the thousands. We're talking about people who'd never even touched an airplane before, suddenly learning how to build them. The entire industrial base of America was shifting gears. They called it the arsenal of democracy, and it wasn't just propaganda. It was actually happening. Factories that had been making cars and tractors were retooling to make aircraft parts. Steel mills were ramping up output. Aluminum refineries were expanding. Tool and die shops were working around the clock. The whole country was waking up to this new reality. Meanwhile, across the ocean, German leadership had no clue what was coming their way. Here's where things get really interesting. Germany actually had someone on the ground who knew exactly what was happening. General Friedrich von Bötticher was their military attaché in Washington from 1933 all the way through 1941. This guy had a front-row seat to everything America was doing. And get this, he wasn't sitting around playing golf. Bötticher was sending detailed messages back to Berlin about what he was seeing. Real, accurate information about American industrial mobilization. In December 1940, he sent a cable that basically said, "Hey, American war production is going to reach unimaginable heights. Like, you guys need to pay attention to this." So, what did Berlin do with this information? They tossed it in the trash, called it defeatist exaggeration. They genuinely believed their own guy was being way too pessimistic, that he'd been in America too long and had gotten soft or something. But here's the wild part. This wasn't just about ignoring one report. When Bötticher actually met with Hitler back in February 1939 to discuss American industrial potential, Hitler wasn't interested. Instead of listening to intelligence from his own expert who'd been living in America for years, Hitler just went off on his own ideas about American society. He'd already made up his mind about what Americans could and couldn't do, and no amount of actual facts was going to change that. This kind of thinking went all the way through German leadership. The Luftwaffe Intelligence Division was doing the same thing. When reports started coming in about women entering aircraft factories by the hundreds of thousands, they dismissed it as a sign that America was desperate. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that maybe, just maybe, this was actually a sign of strength, that bringing more people into factories could actually work. Listen, when analysts heard about factories running 3 shifts around the clock, they assumed the numbers had to be exaggerated. It didn't fit their understanding of how things worked. German leadership had convinced themselves that their way of doing things was superior, and American industrial reality just didn't match up with what they expected. They'd made up their minds and weren't changing them. So when information came in showing they might be wrong, they just couldn't process it. Bötticher kept sending messages. He kept trying to tell them what was really happening. But Berlin had already decided what they wanted to believe, and actual intelligence from the field wasn't going to get in the way of that belief. Meanwhile, back in America, engineers were solving problems that German leadership didn't even think existed yet. Now let's talk about Willow Run, because this is where things get absolutely crazy. Ford Motor Company decided they're going to build the world's largest factory under one roof. We're talking 3.5 million square feet with an assembly line stretching 1 full mile. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, made this incredibly bold promise. They're going to build 1 B-24 Liberator bomber per hour. Keep in mind, other factories were managing 1 per day if they were lucky. Construction started on April 18, 1941, on farmland in Michigan. The scale was unlike anything anyone had attempted, but ambition and execution are two very different things. And at first, Willow Run was an absolute nightmare. The first bomber rolled out in September 1942, and it was a complete disaster. They had to completely rebuild it. Quality control failures were hitting 50%. Half of what they were producing wasn't usable. By February 1943, Willow Run had only produced 56 bombers total. 56 they'd been promising hundreds per month. The media absolutely destroyed them. Critics started calling it Will It Run instead of Willow Run. People in Washington were openly wondering if this whole thing was a mistake. From the outside, it looked like one of the biggest failures in American industrial history. But Ford's engineers weren't panicking, they were problem-solving. A B-24 bomber has 488,193 individual parts. Almost 500,000 separate pieces that all have to fit together perfectly. For context, a car back then had maybe 30,000 parts, so they were dealing with something 16 times more complex. So what did they do? They broke it down. They divided the entire aircraft into manageable sub-assemblies, wings, fuselage sections, tail assemblies, bomb bay doors. Each section became its own production line with dedicated teams. They developed new hydraulic riveting tools that let less experienced workers achieve high quality consistently. They prefabricated wiring harnesses instead of running individual wires throughout each plane. And here's something crazy. In 1943 alone, they had to accommodate 578 design changes. That's more than one change every single day while trying to maintain and increase production. Most factories would have collapsed. Willow Run kept grinding. The numbers started improving. By September 1943, they hit 148 bombers for the month. By December, 365. They were getting there, but they still hadn't hit that 1 per hour goal. Then April 1944 happened. Willow Run produced 428 B-24 bombers that month. Let's do the math. That's 720 hours in a month running 24/7. They made 428 bombers. That works out to one complete bomber every 63 minutes, around the clock, never stopping. They'd actually done it. Every 63 minutes, a complete 4-engine bomber weighing 36,000 pounds empty rolled out the door, ready to fly. While you're having lunch, a bomber gets finished. While you're sleeping through the night, 8 more get completed. It never stopped. But here's the part that should blow your mind. This single factory sitting on former farmland in Michigan was now outproducing the entire German aviation industry. Not one German factory, all of them combined. Everything Germany had, all their facilities, all their resources, all their experienced engineers, couldn't keep up with what one American factory was doing. The factory that critics had mocked as Will It Run had become Germany's worst nightmare. Every B-24 that rolled off that line was another bomber heading toward German targets. And they couldn't stop it. They couldn't bomb it. It was 4,000 miles away. They couldn't sabotage it. They couldn't slow it down. And here's the kicker. Willow Run wasn't even alone. It was just the most dramatic example of what was happening all across America. Ford's success was being repeated at Boeing in Seattle, at Douglas in California, at Consolidated in Texas, at dozens of other facilities. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just a catchy phrase anymore, it was real, and it was terrifying if you were on the other side. So German pilots in combat were the first ones to really understand what was happening, and honestly, it must have been terrifying. Major Heinz Baer was one of Germany's top aces with 220 victories. In January 1944, he flew a mission over Brunswick and later described what he saw. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon. At least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. His group? 8 fighters. 8 against hundreds. He said it was hopeless. But it wasn't just that one mission. This was becoming the new normal. By 1944, the numbers had gotten absolutely ridiculous. That year alone, American factories produced 96,270 aircraft. Let me break that down for you. 16,048 four-engine bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 other multi-engine aircraft. In 1 year. That single year's output exceeded Germany's entire wartime production of approximately 94,677 aircraft. Read that again. 1 American year beat Germany's entire war. The math was brutal for German pilots. Germany was losing 1,200 fighters every month while producing 1,000. They were going backwards. America, producing 2,500 fighters monthly while losing only 400. The gap wasn't just big, it was getting bigger every single month. And it wasn't just aircraft. The whole industrial ecosystem had shifted into overdrive. General Motors alone produced 57,658 aircraft engines. Just one company. Packard built 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license. Alcoa's aluminum output increased 600%. That's not a typo. 600% more aluminum than before the war started. Boeing's Seattle plant was cranking out 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses every single day by May 1944. Douglas Aircraft, which had employed just 68 people back in 1936, had grown to 167,000 workers spread across 9 facilities. North American Aviation was churning out 500 P-51 Mustangs every month. Lockheed achieved production of 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes while simultaneously implementing over 2,000 combat-driven modifications. Think about what that means on the ground. Every 90 minutes, another P-38 rolls off the line. Every day, 16 more B-17. Every month, 500 more Mustangs. It never stopped. The factories ran 24/7, and the numbers just kept climbing. Here's what that looked like in actual combat. Each American bomber carried 13 50-caliber machine guns loaded with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German fighters were increasingly launching missions with partial ammunition loads because they didn't have enough to go around. American bombers had powered turrets, advanced bomb sights, sophisticated navigation equipment. German fighters often flew without functioning radios because they couldn't produce enough. The disparity wasn't just about quantity anymore, it was about everything. Better equipment, more ammunition, superior logistics, and an endless supply of replacements. When the Americans lost 60 B-17s during the raid on Schweinfurt, which they called Black Thursday because the losses were so heavy, they replaced every single one of those bombers within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. For Germany, losing 60 aircraft was a catastrophe they couldn't recover from. For America, it was barely a speed bump. The factories were winning the war as surely as any army in the field, and German leadership was finally starting to realize they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation about American industrial capacity. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because who was actually building all these aircraft is going to surprise you. In 1941, women made up less than 1% of aircraft workers. By 1943, 65%. That's 310,000 women working in aircraft factories across the country. And we're not talking about simple jobs. These women were doing complex manufacturing work that required serious skill. Rose Monroe became the face of this transformation, the original Rosie the Riveter. She worked at Willow Run, and get this, she was driving 3,000 rivets per shift with 99.5% accuracy. Think about that for a second, 3,000 rivets every single day, and she's hitting 99.5% precision. That's not beginner work, that's mastery. But here's what's wild, the quality actually got better when women joined the workforce. At Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, women inspectors reduced defect rates from 3.2% down to 0.3%. That's a massive improvement. The work wasn't just getting done faster, It was getting done better. Ford had to redesign their tools because women generally had smaller hands than the men who'd been working there before. And you know what happened? Those lighter, better-designed tools accidentally made everyone more efficient. The new pneumatic tools reduced fatigue for all workers. Better-positioned workstations decreased injuries across the board. They'd made improvements trying to accommodate new workers and ended up making the whole operation better. German intelligence was watching all this happen, and they completely misread what it meant. They saw women flooding into factories and thought, oh, the Americans are desperate. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. They figured quality was going to collapse any day now. They were convinced this was a sign of American weakness. They couldn't have been more wrong. Turns out women excelled at a lot of the detailed work: wiring, instrument installation, inspection, the precision work that required steady hands and attention to detail. Women were crushing it. At Douglas Long Beach, 22,388 out of 41,620 employees were women. That's more than half the workforce, and that facility was producing some of the highest quality aircraft in the country. But it wasn't just women. The workforce transformation went way beyond gender. People from all walks of life, backgrounds that had been shut out of good manufacturing jobs before, were suddenly essential to the war effort. This was democratic mobilization on a scale nobody had seen before. Everyone who could contribute did. The workforce that walked into those factories in 1941, knowing absolutely nothing about aircraft, came out in 1945 as the most skilled aviation workers in the world. They didn't just build planes, they revolutionized how manufacturing worked. The techniques they developed, the quality control methods they perfected, the production innovations they pioneered, all of that became the foundation for how modern manufacturing operates today. German leadership had bet everything on their system being superior. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. So while American factories were hitting these incredible production numbers, Germany was falling apart. And their response to it made things even worse. In February 1944, Germany launched this program to disperse their aircraft production into 729 underground facilities scattered all over the place. The idea was that if they couldn't be bombed, they could keep producing. Sounds logical, right? Except it was a disaster. Here's what happens when you scatter production across hundreds of locations. Coordination becomes impossible. You've got parts being made in one facility that need to go to another facility 50 miles away for assembly. Transportation delays pile up. Quality control falls apart because you can't maintain standards across that many sites. Communication breaks down. The whole system just collapses under its own complexity. These underground factories were producing more defects than actual usable aircraft. The entire Mittelwerk complex, which was supposed to be this huge production center, was producing fewer engines per month than Ford's single plant in Chicago. One American factory was outproducing their entire underground network. Meanwhile, Germany had one genuine technological breakthrough, the Me-262 jet fighter. This thing was incredible. It was 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. When it worked, it was absolutely devastating. Hitler and Göring genuinely believed this wonder weapon could turn everything around despite being outnumbered. But here's the problem. Germany only managed to produce 1,430 Me-262s total, and they never had more than 200 operational at the same time. The engines required complete overhaul every 10 flight hours. They didn't have the materials they needed, so they had to use inferior substitutions that made the planes even less reliable. Compare that to what America was doing. Yeah, the Me-262 was more advanced than anything the Allies had flying, but America had already started developing their own jets back in 1942. The Bell P-59 didn't work out great, but Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star was actually superior to the German jets and entered production before the war even ended. That's the difference. Germany had to bet everything on one design. America could pursue multiple technologies at the same time. They didn't have to choose between maintaining current production and developing next-generation aircraft. They just did both. And then D-Day happened on June 6, 1944. The numbers from that invasion tell you everything you need to know. The Allies put 11,590 aircraft in the sky. Germany managed 319 sorties. That's not a battle. That's not even a fair fight. That's 36-1 air superiority. It's complete and total dominance. Between January and May 1944, preparatory bombing for the invasion dropped 145,000 tons on German targets. That's more than all the bombing Germany did to Britain during the entire war. Transport aircraft delivered 3 complete airborne divisions in one day using more planes than Germany's entire transport fleet ever had. By December 1944, single American raids involved 1,200 bombers escorted by 900 fighters. P-51 Mustangs had the range to reach Poland, the performance to match any opponent, and existed in such quantities that losses didn't even matter anymore. German pilots called them Indians because they seemed to be everywhere at once, swarming from every direction. The resource gap had become so massive there was no way to overcome it. Germany couldn't produce enough, couldn't train enough pilots, couldn't supply enough fuel, couldn't maintain what they had. The whole system was breaking down, while American production just kept accelerating. By 1945, even Göring couldn't ignore reality anymore. During his final months, Göring became absolutely obsessed with the production numbers. A psychologist who spent time with him documented what was happening. Göring would sit there for hours, calculating ratios over and over again, comparing single American factories to entire German production networks. He'd write out the numbers, stare at them, recalculate them, trying to make sense of how the gap had gotten so massive. And he kept coming back to one thing, Willow Run. That one factory in Michigan haunted him. He called it that damned factory that broke our backs. Out of everything that had happened, that single building was what he couldn't get past. In July 1945, he finally said what he'd been denying for years. I knew American industrial potential was great, but the execution exceeded my worst fears. That single factory at Willow Run produced more aircraft than our entire bomber force at peak. It was incomprehensible. He'd spent years telling everyone that American production was propaganda, exaggeration, impossible. Now he was confronting the reality that one factory had exceeded everything Germany had managed. But it wasn't just the aircraft. He got stuck on the logistics too. Your ability to supply forces across 2 oceans while maintaining domestic production. This was beyond our conception. We couldn't adequately supply forces 500 miles from Germany. You supplied armies 5,000 miles from America. That's a guy realizing his entire understanding of how war works was wrong. Germany couldn't supply troops a few hundred miles away, while America was running supply lines across entire oceans and still ramping up domestic production. Someone showed him the complete production statistics. Charts laying out everything, American monthly aircraft output compared to German annual production, films of assembly lines, numbers for engines, aluminum, every component. Göring just stared at them in silence. 812,615 American aircraft engines, 241,675 German. He'd spent years making decisions based on the assumption that Germany could compete. The real numbers weren't even close. You can see in his statements how he went from denial to comprehension in stages. First, he couldn't believe the numbers were real. Then he rationalized, okay, maybe quantity, but quality must be terrible. Then he had to accept the quality was actually better. Then he argued German technology was superior. Finally, he hit the wall of realizing technological superiority means nothing when you're outnumbered 5-1. In one of his final letters, October 1946, he wrote his most complete admission. The Americans won through industrial power, not military prowess. We were not defeated by better soldiers, but by better factories. The nation we dismissed as capable only of building consumer goods buried us under aluminum and steel. The nation we dismissed. He's acknowledging that the dismissal was the mistake, that taking American industrial capacity seriously might have changed everything. But they didn't. They laughed instead. His very last recorded statement was probably the most honest thing he ever said. We declared war on an industrial giant while it slept. When it awoke, we were doomed. They didn't just outproduce us. They revolutionized production itself. Every aspect of their system proved superior to ours. Every aspect. That's not just admitting you lost. That's admitting you were wrong about everything. The man who'd laughed at Roosevelt's announcement of 50,000 planes spent his final days knowing America had built 300,000. He'd dismissed American factory workers and died knowing those workers had revolutionized manufacturing. He'd believed their system was unbeatable and had to accept that it had been buried under democratic production. His mockery in May 1940 became history's most expensive joke. And in the end, he knew it. The numbers didn't lie. The reality he'd spent years denying had caught up with him. So let's put the final numbers on the table. From 1940 to the end of the war, America produced 295,959 military aircraft. In less than 5 years, they went from 3,600 planes to nearly 300,000. At peak, 2 million Americans were working in aircraft factories. People from every background, folks who'd been shut out of good jobs before, became the most skilled aviation workers in the world. They walked in knowing nothing about aircraft and walked out having revolutionized manufacturing. The innovations didn't just win a war, they changed everything. Quality control methods created for bombers became standard worldwide. Automation principles from Willow Run transformed global manufacturing. The engineers who designed bomber assembly lines went on to design rockets. The workers who riveted B-24s raised the generation that walked on the moon. But here's what really matters. It's a lesson about assumptions. Göring heard Roosevelt's announcement of 50,000 planes and laughed. He was so confident in his assumptions that he ignored his own intelligence officers. He couldn't imagine a country focused on consumer goods pivoting to military production. He didn't believe bringing that many people together could work. He assumed technological superiority would always beat numbers. He was catastrophically wrong about all of it. America didn't just hit that impossible target. They doubled it. They built 300,000 aircraft while fighting across 2 oceans. The workers who weren't supposed to succeed revolutionized manufacturing itself. The biggest miscalculations don't come from bad math. They come from assumptions about what's possible, from underestimating what people can achieve when they're motivated and working together, from confusing the way things have always been with the way things have to be. Göring spent May 1940 laughing at a ridiculous idea. He spent his final months in 1946 obsessing over how that idea had become reality. The man who mocked 50,000 planes died knowing America had produced 6 times that number. His laughter became the sound of the most expensive mistake anyone ever made. The lesson? Pretty simple. Never assume something can't be done just because it's never been done before. Never underestimate what people can build when they decide something matters. And definitely don't laugh at someone who says they're going to try something impossible. Because sometimes they don't just prove you wrong, they rewrite the rules entirely. So that's the story of how one man's laughter turned into history's biggest "I told you so." If this blew your mind like it did mine, smash that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about massive historical miscalculations and the people who proved everyone wrong. And drop a comment. What's the biggest assumption you think people are making today that's going to look ridiculous in hindsight? Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.